Welcome back. It's Miss Solomon here, and we are continuing our exploration of how Ovid's epic poem Metamorphoses has and continues to shape contemporary thought. So, in this particular video of the series, we will look at the myths of Jove and Europa, Ceres and Proserpina, Iphis and Isis, as well as Pygmalion. So just when we think we can't be more over Jove's antics, we see him at it again in the Jove and Europa myth when he abducts Europa by transforming himself into a magnificent white bull. Ovid gives us a scene that is terrifying and honestly strangely playful. Europa, a Phoenician princess, is at first charmed by the bull's gentleness, so much so that she even climbs onto his back. Once she does, however, he charges into the sea and carries her across the waves of Crete. The tone of this myth mixes innocent curiosity with sudden danger, which is a classic example of Ovidian irony. Ovid will invite us to feel that tension between beauty and threat. So the bull is gentle, almost inviting affection, yet that gentleness hides a god and that particular god's calculated power. So let's take a look together at the last several lines of the Jove and Europa myth from our textbook for case in point. So read along with me. Now he disports himself upon the grass and lays his whiteness on the yellow sands. And as she slowly overcomes her fear, he offers up his breast for her caresses and lets her decorate his horns with flowers. The princess dares to sit upon his back, not knowing who it is that she has mounted. And he begins to set out from dry land, a few steps on false feet, into shallows. Then further out and further to the middle of the great sea, he carries off his booty. She trembles as she sees the shore receding and holds the creature's horn in her right hand, and with the other clings to his broad back, her garments streaming in the wind behind her. Based on the language and movement of this final scene, Jove's abduction of Europa is both seduction and a kidnapping, leaving us to reflect on where wonder begins, where it ends, and where especially violation begins, and if it ends. So, at the heart of the Jove and Europa myth is migration. The name Europa becomes the derivative name of an entire continent, Europe. With this signifier, the single act of divine passion between Jove and Europa is literally printed a larger testament to the power of myth in art and literature. The myth takes on a new and lasting memory because it is now inextricably linked to our geography. So, in a sense, Europe is aptly named for it is conquered and conquering. More textually, however, Europa's journey from Phoenicia to Crete reflects how myths themselves migrate, just as they have done from the Greek to the Roman, even in Ovid's time. So they are going to cross cultures and languages. They're going to gather new meanings as they move, and they shape identity far beyond their original setting. Stories will move and encounter other names and other cultures to take on names of their own. And in the end, because of all of this retelling, reshifting, and remaking, who's to say that any of these myths can be truly owned? But out of all of these myths and their reappropriations in the language, who can truly own a name? Especially when you have this relationship between Europa and Europe and the greater stories that have been told as a result. The myth itself just keeps resurfacing, even if it's in subtle subtexts. We will see the myth depicted in Renaissance paintings, labeled to a moon of Jupiter. And more recently, in 2024, the Europa Clipper is set on a mission to arrive at the moon of Jupiter, Europa, by 2030. So while we could go through the exhaustive overlaps of how this myth still resonates today, I believe we can boil it down to two recurring topics that we see in media and just in our general discourse. So the first is about consent and power. In our literature and film, especially, we are constantly re-examining seduction stories in a contemporary lens. And then the second one has to do with cultural identity. In retrospect, we pause to comprehend how the Jove and Europa narrative of migration becomes a foundational myth for an entire continent and, by extension, established ways of life, whether they are more rooted in their origin or if they are derivative, even as the culture or cultural paradigms of the entire Western world. It is quite curious that a story of abduction and transformation becomes the very name of Europe. And we wait patiently as NASA follows a group of astronauts to study Europa, the moon. Our political and cultural geography is both directly and indirectly shaped by this ancient myth from crossing seas. And it seems like we keep knowingly or unknowingly playing the same scene out in different ways over and over again. And that is going to resonate the same with our Ceres and Proserpina myth. And so I thank you for making it this far into the video as you've arrived to one of the class favorites of the myths on our reading list for the week. The Ceres and Proserpina myth is a long episode of grief, negotiation, and seasonal change. So Pluto, or the Greek equivalent Hades, abducts Proserpina, who is the Greek equivalent Persephone, into the underworld. And when he does that, her mother, Ceres, Greek equivalent Demeter, begins this desperate search for her daughter. Ceres's sorrow is cosmic. As a result of her grief, the crops are going to wither, the earth will freeze, and the balance between gods and mortals falters. The story on the surface is about the enduring relationship between a mother and a daughter, but in the abstract, it is a timeless narrative about the entire natural cycle of death and renewal. So Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture, roams the world in anguish. She carries torches through the night. She refuses ambrosia or rest after the abduction of her daughter. She confronts gods and men alike, and she demands, no shorter, stronger verb than that. She demands her daughter's return. Only after complex negotiation with Jove is a compromise struck. So Proserpina will spend part of the year in the underworld and then part above. And the enduring nature of this compromise is how much Ovid is able to layer the personal with the political. On one hand, this is a myth, of course, about parental love, and on the other, we get a glimpse into the bargaining that governs everyday life, that may govern larger cities or states or countries, and then maybe even the bargaining that goes on in the cosmos. And because Ovid is going to critique the political culture of his time, he may be saying something about Rome and his bargaining process, but I will leave that to you to chew on. And he is likely extending all of this to talk about any sort of powers that be when it comes to that bargaining in the larger sense. So Ceres' search and habitual acceptance becomes again, another like tension, conflict, metaphor. I think it could take on a number of literary figuratives about storytelling itself. Spring follows winter. Grief gives way to adaptation. Each retelling is a new season in the myth's life. The narrative reminds us that endings are never final. They're going to circle back. Spring after winter, adaptation after loss, again and again. And there's something comforting in that order because although it is compromised and it does have its highs and lows, it will again come to pass. So this ancient rhythm still shapes the modern imagination. First, we're going to have environmental art. It's often going to depict the Demeter Persephone cycle, to comment on anything related to climate change and ecological balance. Second, we see discussions of seasonal architecture and sustainable living. That echoes Ceres' reminder that the natural world responds to human action and the divine will alike. And then lastly, in literature and film, stories of descent and return that we'll see in like speculative fiction or in echo poetry continue to borrow this pattern of death and renewal. One of my personal favorite retellings is one by the one and only Mary Shelley, who wrote the famous novel Frankenstein that you're likely more familiar with. Shelley and her poet husband Percy wrote a play called Proserpine for their children. This play, Proserpine, focuses on the women in the play or in the women even in this myth that we've read from Ovid. And it emphasizes the separation of mother and daughter, as well as the strength offered by a community of women. So while the play has been often criticized and marginalized by critics, there are still some of us who get it, some of us who go out to read it. It's unpublished and you can find it just about anywhere on the internet if you'd like to ever take a look to see how those two brilliant romantic writers, capital R romantic, will transform this narrative for a new audience. By the end of the reading of this myth about Ceres and Proserpina, I hope that we sit a little while and wonder how it reframes the idea of loss and return. Is Proserpina's cyclical return really a compromise? Is it a triumph? Or is it a bittersweet acceptance that change is permanent? It may be, at the very least for me, that sometimes return is not full-bodied. The win may be partial. In the end, a peace might be worth it for this kind of love between mother and daughter. The transformation in this myth is not really like we've seen in other myths up to this point. It's not about a body. But Proserpina is going to transform first because she takes on two names now. She's not just the goddess of spring anymore. She's the queen of the underworld. And that makes her a walking poem of sorts because poems are going to be set up with, even if it's paradoxical, these seeming dichotomies, and you work through that tension as the poem goes on. And it is the world, it's the entire world that's changed by a mother's grand emotion, those of loss and of joy, the loss in winter and then the joy in spring. To me, it sends a powerful message about human agency and how our acts can affect more than our little tiny corner of the universe. Okay. Thank you for making it this far. We are going to move into our next myth of this video in the video series, and we're going to spend time with the story of Iphis and Isis. So, Book 9 is a hotspot of the epic where Ovid has some of his finest moments regarding identity and transformation. So, to frame things, Iphis is born female, but her father, expecting a son, declares he will kill the baby if it's a daughter. So Iphis's mother, Telethusa, following a vision from the goddess Isis, raises Iphis, although born female, as a boy. And so Iphis's life is going to be one built on a careful disguise. As Iphis grows, he, at least presenting he, falls in love with the beautiful Ianthe, which creates kind of a crisis on the eve of their wedding. And so on the day of the wedding, Telethusa prays to several goddesses, including Juno, Hymen, but then the one who's been protecting Iphis all along, Isis, for help. They answer, and Iphis is physically transformed into a man, allowing the marriage to proceed. So look with me in the text when Telethusa realizes that her prayer had been answered. If you'll read along with me. Not yet secure, but nonetheless delighted by this omen, the mother left with Iphis following, as was her wont, and but now with longer strides, darker complexion, and with greater force, a keener countenance, and with her hair shorter than usual and unadorned, and with more vigor than a woman has. And you, who were so recently a girl, are now a boy. So Ovid describes the change as both miraculous and seamless. The outward body finally matches the social role that Iphis has lived all along. This also seems to be blessed by the goddesses themselves who preside over the wedding when Iphis becomes, and I quote, in possession of Ianthe. So this myth gives us a lot of stuff to potentially talk about, and there are several approaches that we can take as literary analysts who seek to see how ancient texts like this one can inform contemporary discourse. Centuries before modern discussions about gender identity, Ovid presents gender and sex as literally changeable. So Iphis's identity is not fixed at birth. She moves, adapts, and ultimately transforms. This transition isn't treated as monstrous, and it's not treated as tragic. It's kind of celebrated as fulfillment. So even in the Roman context, this would have been considered radical because gender norms were sharply defined. And Ovid offers a mythic space where such can be rewritten for us to ask some larger questions. So, because I know that this subject could be potentially controversial, I encourage us all to view this more on broader terms about our identities. So, our outward identities we present to the world. If we are to take anything from this myth to our lives, they could be more authentic to who we are at our core. And Ovid would see that alignment of us living that authentically as a virtuous journey because it is revolutionary to be ourselves. Often, when we feel that we must fall in line with really strict social expectations, we will compromise part of ourselves in the process. Thankfully, Iphis has a mother who loves her enough to want this authenticity for her own daughter. So the mother, Telethusa, this is an act of unconditional love on her part, and it is through this love that Iphis is transformed so that her outward self matches her heart. And not to mention, the goddess Isis rewrites Iphis's plot for her. This divine intervention turns a life of concealment into one of open authenticity. Ovid may be highlighting here how narrative itself is divine because of how it can be changed and made new again. The gods literally change the story, and in doing so, they change the body. And that still gives us a lot to think about and appreciate the flexibility of the Iphis and Isis myth. And next, we are going to move into the myth of Pygmalion. So there will be more changing bodies in this Pygmalion myth, and it is another student favorite in our list for how familiar it is to us in popular media. This story hopefully was just so familiar to you because you've been able to pick up on it in a number of other stories. So this last myth of our video is going to focus on the sculptor Pygmalion, who creates one of the most enduring and adaptable myths in Western art. So Pygmalion, at the beginning of the myth, he's pretty disturbed at what he sees as the flaws of real women. He looks around and can't find one that he's particularly interested in. So what he does is he carves an ivory statue of his ideal woman. So as he chisels, he falls in love with his own creation, and he adorns the statue with jewels and caresses. Take that as you will. And so he's moved by his own he's moved by his own creation. But then Venus, the goddess of love, is moved by his devotion. And so Venus brings the statue to life, and Pygmalion's perfect artwork becomes his living bride. This myth celebrates both artistic obsession and the mysterious power of creation itself. So maybe because Ovid lingers on the tactile intimacy of Pygmalion's craft, I don't know if that's maybe why, but there are sections of the myth that are pretty cringe as you read it. Pygmalion literally praises the gods when he discovers that the statue has turned into the woman of his dreams, and we will see details about her warmth and her veins and all of the kisses that he gives her. And I'm going to spare us all a reading of that scene again and not print it on the screen, but you all have been there to read it. But in this whole scene, Ovid allows Pygmalion's desire and his artistry to blur together. And in it, Pygmalion is both creator and lover who worships an ideal that becomes real for him. And while there are some really questionable bits of behavior presented in the Pygmalion myth, I like what it says about art's independence. A former creative writing professor of mine once told me way back in the day that once we write something and we put it out there, it's not ours anymore. What we make and share takes on a life of its own in a similar way that Galatia, the statue come to life, does. So the moment Venus animates the sculpture, the creation gains a life beyond the sculptor's control. If we are most successful at creating art, I think the art will outgrow its maker, which is what essentially happens with this myth across time. We as a species have been grappling with this idea of art's independence for a hot minute, but specifically the Pygmalion conundrum has been explored and reappropriated several times in popular media. So first you'll see on your screen is George Bernard Shaw's play, Pygmalion, and that play is then going to be adapted into the musical featuring Aubrey Hepburn, My Fair Lady, and it reimagines the myth as a story of shaping another's identities, just as we saw in Ovid's version. And modern films and novels, from like Pictured, the AI romance novel, or excuse me, romance narrative like Her, starring Joaquin Phoenix, to any like robot myths, they repeat this topic of art or invention developing autonomy and then falling in love with the thing that we create. And it raises new question about that dynamic between the human that makes the thing, and what is made. In the end, all poets like Ovid, but especially him, become their own Pygmalion of sorts. So even when we think Pygmalion is cringe and he's probably being a little weird, um, all artists are kind of like Pygmalion in a way. He carved, and we're like Ovid too, because he carved myths that come alive in the reader's imagination, as we do again and again. We create characters and voices who breathe and move beyond our hand, and then it could inspire other stories to the point that we have to do a little bit of digging to find out who the story belongs to. And it may not belong to anybody if it gets this big. It's just all of ours. And so, in that way, it does outgrow the author. Art cannot be truly possessed because it lives beyond the tangible. And then we kind of have this cautionary tale of folded into the Pygmalion myth. So, what if the origin and intention of a transformation bears bad fruit in the long run? When we create art with selfish intention, without recognizing that what we create can never really fully be possessed, the result can become toxic and transformative for the worst. So Pygmalion and Galatia's grandson, Cinyras, bears a daughter, Mira, who is cursed to fall in love with her own father, Cinyras. So Ovid tells how Mira, driven by a divinely imposed desire, deceives her father Cinyras to commit unspeakable incestuous acts. And when the truth is revealed, Mira flees in shame and prays for escape from both life and death. The gods answer by transforming her into a myrrh tree, and her pregnant body is hardened underneath the bark while she continues to weep fragrant tears of sap. Here we have a really complex warning about creation that begins in violation, creation that wades in grief, and then this creation that ends with birth. So in her tree form, Mira exudes this kind of sweet resin, but that sweetness comes from sorrow. And Mira's whole tale is like a shadow to the Pygmalion story. Mira's transformation shows what happens when desire is rooted in transgression. Her change is not liberation, like Daphne's, but a permanent reminder that art, or really any act of creation, cannot be owned without consequence. Though seemingly unfair, this transformation blends art and biology to possibly illustrate that from beauty personified, which is baby Adonis, it can come from great pain. Just like what we do, if you're anything like me and you write things or you create things, just from that shame and the great pain and the seeming marginalization that happens because of the transgression and the shame, something beautiful can be made out of the pain that we endure. And such is the story of Mira and the birth of her baby boy, Adonis, who we'll meet in the next myth. But before then, I want to say thanks for watching the second installment of our video series on Ovid, and I hope you learned something. Find the last video in the series to review the Venus and Adonis myth and some of my closing thoughts. See you there.